Performances, lectures, and screenings of media art and artists, which is the visiting lecture series and course sponsored by the Department of Media Study here at UB. And so many of you are in the course, but many of you are visitors right now because we have a very special evening planned. And to introduce that evening, I will now introduce Millie Chen, who is an artist of many media, and who is an excellent teacher in the Department of Art, and she will introduce our guest and guests. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Sorry I have a rather long-winded introduction, but this has been a very complicated, very rich residency, so it deserves all these words. I'm here partially wearing the hat of former Associate Dean in the College of Arts and Sciences, so I am representing the Dean's office because this is a big part of the WBFO Visiting Artist Residency Series. So on behalf of the Dean's Office and also the Department of Art, Department of Media Study, and all participants at UB, I most enthusiastically welcome you all to the final event of Isaac Julien's WBFO Visiting Scholars in the Arts Residency at University at Buffalo. Isaac Julien is one of Britain's most important and influential installation artists and filmmakers. His work draws from and comments on a range of disciplines and practices, including film, dance, photography, music, theater, painting, and sculpture, integrating them in powerfully evocative and socially perceptive audiovisual film installations, photographic works, and documentary films. He's the recipient of numerous prestigious awards, including the Semaine de la Critique Prize at the Cannes Film Festival, the Pratt and Whitney Canada Grand Prize, the McDermott Award from MIT, the Golden Gate Persistence of Vision Award from the San Francisco Film Festival, the Kano Award for Artistic Excellence, etc. Julien was nominated for the Turner Prize in 2001 for his works, The Long Road to Mazatlan and Vagabondia. Isaac Julien's work has been shown widely, including in the 56th Venice Biennale, Documenta 11, the 7th Gwangju Biennial, the Paris Triennial, the Art Institute of Chicago, the MCA San Diego, the Bass Museum, Miami, the Centre Pompidou, Paris, Museum of Modern Art, New York, DuPont Museum, among others. And currently and relatively locally, the exhibition called Isaac Julien, Other Destinies, is showing at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. And it's on there until April 23rd, so no one has any excuse not to catch it. It's only an hour and a half, 2-hour drive. Two of his multi-screen works are installed there, Western Union Small Boats and True North. So since January, Isaac has been traveling back and forth between Buffalo and Toronto, where he is conducting a joint residency at OCAD University. And it's our pleasure to welcome the visiting faculty and students from OCAD-U who have joined us for tonight's event. Where are you sitting? Oh, hello. So I hope you had a stimulating day doing studio visits with art and media study grad students. During the semester, many UB faculty, including those from art, media study, English, transnational studies, and the Center for Global Media, have incorporated Isaac's films into their syllabi and have helped expose numerous undergraduates and graduates alike to Isaac's work. Area cultural institutions have also participated in hosting screenings, talks, and site work, including the Albright Knox Art Gallery, Hall Walls, Silo City, and Central Terminal. And before I introduce the first speaker for this evening, I want to thank the following for making Isaac Julien's residency at UB possible, starting with WBFO Visiting Scholars in the Arts, Department of Art, Department of Media Study, Center for Global Media, Leslie Lohman Queer Arts Lecture Series, the Queer Studies Research Workshop, the Plasma Lecture Series, the Albright Knox Art Gallery, Hall Walls Contemporary Arts Center, the Center for the Arts, and Dr. Jonathan D. Katz. So tonight, you will be treated to the fruits of Isaac Julien's masterclass, as well as a showing of his 10,000 Waves. The masterclass was created under the direction and guidance of Isaac Julien, along with co-teachers for the course, Professor Sarah Elder and Sarah Kohlberg. One of the participating students, Galia Binder, will tell us about the masterclass and set us up for viewing the students' films. The screenings will be followed by a Q&A with the students. For the final event of the evening, Isaac Julien will speak briefly and show his immersive 9-channel installation, 10,000 Waves, followed by a final Q&A. And please welcome to the mic, Galia Binder.
Hi, I'd also like to welcome my colleague Benjamin Kirsten, who will be providing some remarks after me. So first of all, welcome. Thank you so much for attending this evening's plasma event and for welcoming the Isaac Julien Masterclass to present our works to you. We are undergraduate, PhD, and MFA students from the departments of Art, Media Study, and Poetics. We are artists, cinematographers, performers, critics, poets, musicians, programmers, activists, directors, producers, and storytellers. We've worked with Isaac Julien for the past 2 months to co-create a couple of short pieces and works in progress that you'll see tonight. We want to say thank you to Isaac most of all. Thank you for sharing your brilliance with us. Thank you for your thoughtful mentorship, your insightful critique, your generous feedback. Thank you for your time, your warmth, and your willingness to include us in your process and to be patient with ours. Our work has been changed significantly by encountering you, and in ways that a few sentences cannot possibly sum up or explain. We shall remember this moment and feel grateful for it always. And here's Ben. Thank you.
In some ways, what Isaac, Sarah, and Sarah and this masterclass have asked of us fundamentally opposes the processes of individualization endemic to institutions of higher education and the age of neoliberal capitalism more generally. To ask even a small group of students from different departments with different research interests and skill sets and at a variety of stages in our educational careers to produce a collaborative film brought about conflict, both from the logistical to the interpersonal. Over the past couple months, however, we searched for connections and found the current political moment, the city of Buffalo, and the conversations Isaac facilitated fruitful in this regard. One of the concepts Isaac foregrounds in his recent films and foregrounded in our conversations is capital. In a talk originally delivered at the Whitney in 2014, Isaac argued that we must understand capital before posing alternatives, that is, to image and then imagine. Such tasks test the possibilities of visual representation, for as Isaac continually pointed out in the same talk, capital itself is an abstraction. We thus considered the principles which David Harvey argues characterize capital, including process, flow, and social relations. We filtered these principles through a lens of local history. Buffalo and the surrounding region provided a wealth of material which helped us ground our conversations in the forms and movements, past and present, around us. From early explorers of Niagara Falls and the local involvement in the Underground Railroad to Buffalo's large refugee population and rampant gentrification, the region teems with the racialized movement of people and capital. Buffalo's post-industrial landscape and position on the water provided forms through which we could think through these movements. Pharaoh and Tony will present works in progress to illuminate some of these themes and our joint creative processes. Though we present works in progress to you this evening, they can never capture the more intimate moments of learning we have shared together. Annette recounted her joy at seeing Blackness and gay sexuality tenderly intertwined and portrayed in Isaac's 1989 film Looking for Langston many years ago. George read poetry in classical Chinese. Galia shared her experiences of local activism with Open Buffalo and other organizations. Pharaoh brought the lyrics of Frank Ocean. We posed questions such as how does nostalgia operate in both the critical acclaim showered upon La La Land and Trump's campaign slogan, Make America Great Again? How can we, as students with significant institutional privilege, ethically engage with Buffalo and the people who populate it using what we have learned from our time with Isaac? How can we work together?
She told stories. She told stories of home. A far off place. A far off place that couldn't exist. A paradise for folks where people ran free and far. Salt steps or crisp dreamy lips. Where people ran free. No more mother, no more father. She told of her cries. No more mother, no their laughs. More father. Another link chain mother. Tell me, share. She remembered the journey. Another link chain. She remembered their laughs. She remembered.
Hansi Momo was on the cello. Audio, a lot of it. Sounds in there, and also Annette was singing a special two performers to them. Say a little about what you did or something.
Y'all can hear me? Hello everybody, my name is Naeem Ricard. I'm a senior media studies production concentration here. And so just a little bit about my participation in the project. I did a lot of the shooting, the cinematography, and the editing. And basically piecing all the footage together and creating this final product that you guys all see. And just hope you guys really enjoyed that visual sensory experience right there.
My name is Annette Daniels-Taylor. I'm a first-year MFA in Department of Media Studies, and I wrote the poem. I created a song, and I was in it.
And you directed it.
And I co-directed with Tony Yannick, who is Tony here? Tony's not here, and Tony did a lot of the shooting as well. And
I'm George Life. I'm a PhD student in English, and I read the couplets in classical Chinese and was involved in finding some of the archival material that was used.
Hi, I'm Galia Binder. I'm an MFA in Media Study, and I produced the project.
I'm Benjamin Kirsten. I'm a PhD student in visual studies. I, like George, helped find archival footage and was kind of in the background in some of the conceptual development of the project.
Does anybody have any questions? Questions? Anybody?
Yes, in the back.
For Annette, what was the song that you sang along with the movies? There was one in the movie that you sang it.
That was the same piece. I was just, ad-libbing some riffs with Stanzi. While we were watching the rough cut that Naeem was putting together, Isaac had the idea that we could do a live performance today, and we all agreed, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. And so it was, Tony and I went into the silos during production. He had an idea to use the echo effect inside the silos and record them and have me simply ad-lib some of the lines from the poem and sing song, hum, and so we were there for a couple of hours doing a bunch of different things, and that's what you hear. Yes, hello?
Hi. Can you tell us a bit about the process, where you began? Conceptually, was it music, was it poetry, was it just shooting?
Who wants to take that? We started in confusion. That's how we started conceptually. Isaac gave us as much information as he could, and I think we probably had, when you have so many options, you don't know where to start. But I think after a while of meeting and talking and really thinking about what Isaac was saying to us and what Isaac was showing us, we really came up with what we could do. And then I presented a poem, and once we got the poem, I think we started to sort of take off from that. And we started to sort of analyze the poem, and and I got all these different theory ideas about what the poem was about, and I was very excited. That's wonderful. That's great. I didn't know it was about that. So we just sort of, that was a jumping point for us. Good? Come on, I know you guys got questions. We got questions. Yes, Rachel.
There was a lot of layers in this piece, and I know Isaac is known for his multi-channel. What made you decide on layering it instead of just making another channel of video?
Onto that. So, obviously, with Isaac Julien being, the instructor, we gained some influence from his style. But the layering wasn't a direct reflection of, his style of work. It was mainly to couple with the audio aesthetic. It was a lot of, if you listen to it in detail, it was hard to do it because of the live performance, but you had George doing the Mandarin and Chinese towards the end, and you had Annette doing a lot of ad-libs within the audio, and then the silo had the echoes. So we wanted to kind of maximize on that by layering a lot of different images, a lot of different symbolism with the gates, and just different images, so you guys can connect the dots basically with the audio. So, yeah.
Good. Yeah. Awesome. It's good to hear. Yeah. JP, you don't have a question?
I do. I always do.
What's your question?
Yes, thank you.
I know for some of you, filmmaking is not where you sit comfortably in your your day-to-day lives. How was that process? And I guess this is for all of you.
Oh no, I live and die this thing. This is what I do. I'm just kidding.
Yes.
Yes, I'm in English, so I don't make films. Although I am a poet, so a lot of my interest, especially in Isaac's films, is analogies that can be made, across media. But also, I'm very interested in working with archival textual material. So it's a very easy move from thinking about using textual archival work and finding found footage or photographs that can then be edited with footage that the actual filmmakers here are taking. And also, oh, Ben.
Great.
It was a tough process. As all kinds of difficulties. It felt like in some ways we as a group were trying to recreate the interdisciplinarity that Isaac embodies, right? He comes to us as a theorist and an artist, and we were kind of bringing these disparate parts. I think more time might have been helpful in this regard, because I think we experienced some difficulties in terms of the process of providing feedback, and kind of opening up that interplay between the work and the response a little more. But ultimately, I mean, this approach is kind of about, like, I felt like what we were thinking about was how can we produce a work which embodies these theories about capital and movement and the way those play out. And so those themes needed teasing out, which maybe happened more towards the beginning of the process, but definitely were worked in there.
Just talk a little bit about how you started with the poem and the cello work.
But Tanya has a question, actually.
All right, thank you.
And then we can, yeah, and then we'll definitely talk about
I
that.
was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the live component of the piece. You said it was a spontaneous decision. So I'm wondering, was it just to add another dimension to the piece, or what informed your thinking?
It was to add another dimension to the piece, and it was also to sort of, this is a rough cut. And after viewing it as a group, we thought that there were some issues with audio that we wanted to change. And when Isaac suggested, well, why don't we show it with a live performance, and that can actually bring it to the place audio where we sort of want it to be, or at least can give us sort of a sketch of what that would sort of sound like. And I think that sort of worked for us now. I think we sort of get what he was talking about. And it was it's a fun experiment. Stanzi was up for it, I was up for it, y'all up for it.
Those are an interesting and very exciting emerging field of live cinema that you might want to explore. So I think you're on something here with this live component.
Well, in the past, during Isaac's lectures with us, he had shown us and told us about different ways that he incorporated live performance with his exhibitions and with his screenings. And so, I hadn't really thought about that. I've seen that before, but I hadn't thought about that with this piece. And so now, that's just something else for us to play with as artists, which I think is great.
We might have dancers next, who knows?
Yeah, might have dancers next.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, as far as jumping in with the live cello, and that being that was like a kind of a blast kind of thing of like, oh, let's try this. I have thought, I think I felt fine doing that, because I do think a lot about live cinema and what is that relationship between this thing that you're watching on the screen and the way that live improvisation and live art forms can interact with it. So, yeah, it's an interesting, I agree. It's a really interesting area.
It's really intriguing.
Yeah.
What were some of the conversations or dialogues that happened in relationship to the archival footage, as far as sort of like retaining maybe its history or its relevance, and then also being respectful? Like, were there conversations amongst that? Because it seemed like there were a lot of consideration when that footage came into play.
We had a lot of conversations about the archival footage with Isaac and alone. Something that Isaac told us to, I think, be aware of, that we were really considering was not to veer toward traditional documentary with talking heads, and so we were really trying to create an abstract, poetic piece that still used the found footage as as something really relevant and can add to that?
And I think it was also one of the ways that we were, even if it wasn't directly apparent for our own process, to make sure we were tied into the local history. Towards the end, we had some conversations around sort of where the line between archival footage and, say, like stock footage overlap, and where that gets a little blurry. And so in this case, I mean, all I think I can really do is speak to like the process of like searching through the UB archives, looking into the Langston Hughes Institute, which was an institute here in Buffalo, and just that process of digging through local history.
Somebody from the outside, I thought I could make an observation that you've made a film which in some ways is very connected to the history of filmmaking in this northern part of the United States, the use of layers, an experiment with overlapping images which you get, whether in Jonas Mekas or Tom Chamont or something. You may not have been thinking about that when you were making it, but when I'm watching it, seeing it here in Buffalo, I'm thinking you've somehow managed unconsciously or consciously to key into a particular way of working with multiple images, which was developed well before the whole digital phase. So, and it has a filmic feel to it, which I think is very nice mix of film and the digital material. So it's more like saying, that's great.
Thank you. Thank you. We appreciate that, Mr. Nash.
Yes.
But perhaps in a similar, that we know the famous invocation of Roland Barthes of image, music, text, being connected through the slashes or whatever, right? How do you perceive that, the slashes, as it were, the connections or lack thereof, or however you wish to perceive it, of that, those things that at once separate but connect image, music, and text?
I am not going to take that.
Sorry, what was the question?
Yeah.
Well, maybe I'll try to take it on, and
Thank
someone
you.
can take over if I totally flub it here. But yeah, I mean, I think first of all, we were really thinking about poetic rhythm, visual and sonic rhythm, and of course, under Isaac's instruction. I mean, Isaac really masterfully taught us, I think, about rhythm and dissonance, right, and how to, through watching many of his works, and he talked critically about his process, really thinking about rhythm, juxtaposition rather, and montage. So, and also thinking about written poetry, spoken poetry, visual poetry, sonic poetry, and music. And so through our own disciplines as well as, through Isaac's works, I think we were able to explore and connect around our separate disciplines and how they kind of tackle these things. That helps. Yes.
And one thing I've found very interesting watching the film, Isaac's films with him, was thinking about the sound, and he was very much encouraging us to try to get the sound down first and develop the images from that, and also in many ways from that to think about images rhythmically or musically rather than, what is the kind of narrative subject matter thread going to be?
Don't show what the text says. Do something different. That is the lesson of the master class. And always clean the lens. Thank you.
So, and briefly, I'm sure, I know we're way past our time, but Tony Yannick, who's our other editor, unfortunately his hard drive crashed really tragically. So he may come in during the last minute to show you a couple of minutes if he's able, but I just wanted to say he wanted to be able to present his work tonight, so unfortunately he may not be doing that. Okay. Well, thank you so much for your questions. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, well, that was very fantastic in terms of seeing that work come together, and so I've had a really fantastic experience working here with the class, and I think it's also kind of, I'm hoping that maybe we will get to see Tony's work, because he's made a multiple screen piece, and I think he's been very much inspired by the multiple screen work which I'm going to be showing you later on. And what I wanted to do was just to really, perhaps because I know we could be a bit crushed for time, was to kind of go through some slides which will kind of, in a way, contextualize the showing of 10,000 Waves. In November 2006, I travelled to Lancashire in the north of England with the poet Wang Ping and the producer and writer Colin McCabe. We'd come to visit Morecambe Bay, a vast, beautiful expanse of mudflats teeming with nature. The bay is notorious for fast-moving tides and quicksand. The locals say the tide can come in faster than a horse can run. In this grandiose landscape, 2 years before our visit, a team of Chinese cockleshell pickers had been working out in the mudflats. As it grew late, a team of British cockleshell pickers turned to head back to dry land, passing the Chinese team on their way. They later claimed in the court that they had attempted to warn the Chinese cockleshell pickers by pointing at their watches and at the sea. Whether due to the language barrier or the desire to work to the last possible moment, their advice was not heeded. At around 9:30 p.m. that evening, the Chinese pickers were cut off by the incoming tide. They all tried to return to the shore. 15 survived, but 23 were lost. Wang Ping, Colin, and I visited the site of the tragedy to turn to understand the events. Of course, walking around the windswept bay over 2 years after the tragedy, we saw no traces. Time, the police, the sea had taken any clues. As investigations, court cases, and inquiries asked about what happened and who was responsible, I sought to understand what had brought the cockerel pickers so far to perish in the cold North Atlantic Sea. Over the next 4 years of research and filmmaking, I delved into the Chinese politics, culture, history, and myth. The majority of the cockle pickers who perished came from the Fujian province of China, which was a long history of migration that far predates movements of globalization or the rather provincial debate around migration that we experience in England today and elsewhere. Again, this tragedy brought the ugly truth behind the precarious migrant labour into mainstream conservation. In the UK, Morecambe Bay was a generation-defining tragedy, but I had been there before in 2007 when I made a work called Western Union Small Boats. In Lampedusa, where I filmed the part of Western Union Small Boats, there's almost nothing out of the ordinary for bodies to turn up on the beach. In Lampedusa and in Morecambe Bay, I had the same question. What drives people to cross continents in search of a better life? The same answer kept coming up: capital. So, as a work conceived and made over 4 years, 10,000 Waves resulted from a long process from which I had the chance to collaborate with some of China's leading artistic voices, including the prominent Chinese film actress from Hong Kong, Maggie Chong, the rising star of Chinese film, independent film, Zhao Tao, which you see here in this image, the poet Wang Ping, master calligrapher Gong Sagan, and Yang Fudong, the acclaimed video artist, and 100-strong Chinese cast crew with the film's original music scored by the fellow East Londoner Jia Wobble and the Chinese dub orchestra, and the contemporary classical composer Maria Del Ver, who performed the live event, at the René Sofia in 2010. The film's poetic links to Shanghai of the past and present, symbolizing Chinese tradition or transition towards modernity and aspiration, influence, and so-called better life. Therefore, I employed a visual language of cinematic translation of ghost stories with current figures, images appearing and disappearing rhythmically as well as spatially, forming a new cartography, a choreography. So thinking about new technologies, we cannot separate the image and knowledge from the way we used to. To my mind, it would seem that the question of cognition, of who's looking and who's been altered by new technologies. In this way, the digital revolution has to a certain extent democratized the image. Certainly not all parts of the world have had access to digital technologies, but in those parts that have, the process of rewriting, reframing, reviewing images have taken place. So in these images, which I'm showing to you now, you have, as it were, the sort of way in which we think quite in depth about how the work's installed and the configuration of the work in relationship to screens, and also, of course, the way in which the work is edited, which we edit, as it were, at times live with separate screens. Here you see me with my editor, Adam Finch, and myself at our studio where we're editing the free screen version of the work. And this question around how to view of what kind of cognition and vision is created by new technologies is important to us because of the question of synchronicity that can be achieved and it's only made available now. That is the fact that on high definition, we can use up to 4 terabytes of information to drive the whole kind of machinery for the filing system, and all different kinds of technological innovations are central to the preoccupation of making these works. I would say that, in a sense, one of the main areas that I've been very much interested in is how can one translate the past into the present and vice versa. But then at the same time, it's really also connected to the questions of movement and the question of the montage. The intention of montage is to suture different sequences in such a way that the past and present reciprocally look at each other and create a critical commentary. The documentary footage thus becomes an indexer element that cuts into the reconstruction scenes of, say, Yishin Island, or in this scene here, where we have footage from the Mao period connected to a sequence where I've taken a poem called Red Chamber Dream and reconstructed that visually. So for me, it's important that the documentary footage to be inserted as a flash forward in physical time, connecting China's history of migration modernity to the 15th century and the present. And so in other sequences, here, for example, this is a scene from the third part of the film, which is the tale of Yishin Island, which is from the Ming period, which is set in the past as a kind of flash forward and connects to the present day event, to the Chinese cocktail pickers at Morecambe Bay. Indeed, Mazu's spectral figure, who's played by Maggie Chong, transverses time and space and guides us through these interlocking strands where she acts as a protector and a goddess who looks over the Morecambe Bay workers, who also originated from the Fujian province, like Mazu herself, mirroring the goddess of the fable. And this ghostly protagonist leads us through the world of Shanghai cinema, to the Shanghai Film Studio, to the streets of modern China, to the archived police footage which you just saw at the beginning of the work, as well as the original emergency calls and helicopter footage from a bird's eye view, which creates distressing dissonance and airy relationship between different gazes which these airborne viewpoints represent. So I'm going here through all the archival references of the work, and then the kind of pictorial ones, and the Brechtian devices of revealing, as it were, the kind of green screen aspects of the work, and the question of images and relationship to violence, which is also a theme in the work. So these are installation views from the Museum of Modern Art. When you look at the work this evening, you're going to see it from how I edit the work with Adam Finch. And what we tend to do is we edit the 9 screens simultaneously and then move into actually showing the work and projecting the work and testing that out on an audience. So what you're seeing now is exactly how you would work in your editing sort of rooms, you know, where you see the work simultaneously. You have the ontological gaze. And what we try to do when we show the work is to break that gaze into many viewpoints. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the work, and I can come back and take questions afterwards. And maybe you might see Tony's multiple screen work too. Thank you.
Sure, which one it is.
Testing. Right, so I guess this is where you can ask me some questions. And I don't know if Tony... Has Tony turned up? No. Okay, all right. Okay, so you'll get to see his free screen, I'm sure, very soon. But he had a few technological difficulties, you know, that his hard drive fried up, well, you know, how that goes. So, but if you have any questions about this work or any questions about, okay, or about the work of the students and our process, I'll be very happy to answer them.
Could you talk a bit more about the spatial arrangement of this piece in an installation environment? I just kept wondering what it's like to experience it in a gallery space, how the screens are positioned, and how the public is invited to interact with them.
Well, I mean, the thing around this work is, I mean, I can just give a little story, which is when I had a show at the Pompidou, I've been making free screen works for some time. But we know that they're de rigueur now, they're kind of a genre, especially for filmmakers who go into making gallery works. So, but let's just say that I think that I pioneered that practice along with a few other people, right? So there's a few co-conspirators in this, not just oneself. If we think about expanded cinema, of course, you know, that we know that, you know, experimental filmmakers were working with the form of expanded cinema in the 60s and the 70s. And so, in a way, this form got adapted through new digital technologies and computer programs, etc. And so this question of synchronicity is the thing which becomes more exacting in terms of what you can achieve when making multiple screen works. And so when I thought we came up, or I could say myself and my curator came up with this clever idea of making a 4-screen work where you'd have 4 screens surround the spectator, and we edited it in a way which had this slightly different mode of editing from the 3-screen works. And so we put the 4 screens up, we set them up for this show, and we put all the cushions into the center of the room, or seats. And so my idea, or I should say our idea, was that the audience would be their editor, so to speak, that they would enter into the space and they would view this work. And what happened is that all of the first day of the opening of the show, at the Pompidou, the audiences grabbed all the seats and moved them to the position where they could see all 4 screens simultaneously. So they just told me something about the way that, you know, audiences view screens and film and moving image works. And so, in a way, we were defeated to a certain extent. And it was very interesting, kind of, I mean, we show that work from time to time, Phantom Creole, it's in the Hirshhorn collection, a few other collections. But basically, when I made this work, we went about trying to make a work and started with the choreography of the screens first before editing the work. So I went to my installer and we did several drawings. The screens, first of all, were in several rooms, and the whole idea was really this kind of theory of the mobile spectator, that if you make works in the cinema context, you sit down, you have your stationary position, and we know all about that, and all the habits that that brings with it. And they're not bad habits, you know, we quite enjoy it. There's nothing wrong with it. But what I wanted to do in the gallery or museum context was to try to create a way of thinking about how one could work with the spectator in a different manner. And so in this sense, we got a choreography constructed through the placement of the screens in a sculpture dimension, and then followed that through in terms of how the work was shot, and then how we would edit that work. And then we would experiment with installing the work during the editing process as the audiences reacted to the work. And so the whole idea was to create this way of being able to view it from different perspectives. There wasn't an ontological gaze, there were different ways of viewing the work and experiencing the work, and putting some of the theories into practice of how one would create that question of movement. Now, whether these questions are connected just to technology or connected to the idea of the fact that, you know, we as subjects, you know, do transvest global spaces. Of course, there's a lot of resistance to that, and hey, I experienced that resistance yesterday coming from Canada into United States, but we won't go into that. But basically, in relationship to the whole idea of being able to move from one space and location, this is something, you know, I always really liked Felix Gonzalez's tourist piece about migration, which he sort of used the image of birds flying. It's a piece that it's a stack piece, you can take the image away. And I think there's a way in which this question of mobility, of movement, something about when spectators come to the cinema, not that they go to sleep, but that there's a whole theory where basically, you know, Godard talks about this, and Brian from Mark, his observation of Godard's idea about the gaze collapsed, you know, and he talks about that relationship to cinema and how we look. And even in our class, when we were shooting images, or the students were shooting images, some of them shot the images so quickly. Both Sarah and I spoke about the fact that when you're shooting an image, that actually maybe you might count to 10 while you're shooting, and then 10 when you're actually shooting the image, and then 10 afterwards, you know, and that might be your shot. And so the whole idea of speed, of time, and how that's really affected how people view, I call it the distracted spectator, you know, so maybe this 9-screen work could be appealing to one, because, you know, most spectators these days, especially younger people, maybe it's generational, are distracted. We talk about them being on their mobile phones, not being able to keep away from, you know, when people go to galleries, you know, they put up their phone to look at an image before they look at the image themselves. So this ruination of how we look is part of our experience of looking. And so all of these ideas were involved in making of that, in this piece. Yep.
How would you consider the relationship of a single screen? Because we're recording. Okay, thanks.
What do you consider the relationship of a single screen projection to then the original installation, spatial experience, immersive? Because this is back to the spectator in the dark cinema. But you know, I mean, it seems my perception of it is that it's choreographed equally heavily, but I'm just curious how you perceive it, if it's a documentation of the original or a different kind of viewing experience.
This is just a slide, you know, so you just saw a slide like in art history. You see paintings, you get familiar with them through slides. So this is what you experience as a slide of the work. It's not the work itself, but basically when the work's installed, I mean, we take a great pleasure in what I call the ontological gaze, if that's the right word for it, you know, but the all-knowing look. And so, I mean, that's how we view. I think in this work, when it's installed, I'm perhaps trying to frustrate that a little, but not probably too much. So basically it's, yeah, and so these are the things that we can do in the gallery, in the museum context, and hark back to some of the early experiments in cinema that took place, but utilising new technologies to do that.
I too was struck by the kind of phenomenological or immersive element of the work and what it must be to experience this work in that state. And I wanted to ask, or just raise something and hope that you might meditate on it for us. When one encounters the work in that space, right, it's like one is almost perhaps inside of the word, you know, the world that the work creates and the imagery and, you know, all of that. But then there's that moment in the film where something turns around and suddenly we're in the construction of the film, right? We're watching the kind of, the means of production, as it were. What is it to situate the viewer first within the world or the space or the social, as it were, that the work creates, and then to turn and situate that same viewer or many viewers within, you know, the means of production, that kind of other side of the work, as in some sense?
Well, I think when we were making it, it was more connected to, I mean, of course, there's some Brechtian concerns, but that's also a bit of a trope in video art, displaying the means of production. But I think there's also the thing around Mazu and the deconstruction of the mythology or the myth or the image that one was constructing. And so revealing, in a way, the technology and the question of the sort of choreography connected to the aesthetics of Hong Kong cinema, you know, and how that's achieved, which is its own art form. And so in a sense, this art form, which is a contribution of Chinese culture to film culture, you know, something, of course, that we, you know, take for granted when we look at films, Hollywood films these days, but, you know, it had a specific specificity to it. So I think there was that was also being reacted. But also I think it was connected to the fact that we shot lots of scenes with green screen, and it's also to do with allowing accidents to happen. So that's the thing which is the most important aspect, that you have accidents, chances, in that Cajun scenario where you let those things into the work. And so there was this aspect as well. And I think for the spectator, well, the spectators can talk for themselves, but I think it's really connected just to this question of choreography, and in a way you reveal how this choreographic scenography is enacted in this sort of way in which technology and film comes together culturally in this space. So it was really an interesting one, and one which I've used those kind of Brechtian strategies before. So I would say that depends on where you are, you know, if you're in MoMA and you see it, then people sometimes get their iPhones out because they think something spectacular might be happening. Or, you know, people are surprised, you know, and they will ask the question, why reveal and break this illusion that you constructed. So yes, and so they're just the things that you can do in the museum space as opposed to traditional cinema.
Just kind of, I had basically the same question, only as I was watching the movie, I was thinking about, like, it first hit me the first time I saw the slate come in during the freeways montage. You see a little bit of slate, and it really sticks out. And kind of from a conceptual point, that almost becomes its own new subject. And I was actually I was thinking about the process images that you included and how you developed it at the end as kind of creating an anti-work to the work, and how that was kind of a metaphor for death, or even for the unconscious, which is so often tied to the sea, which we saw a lot of images of water and somebody drowning or whatever. So I was just wanting you to elaborate a little bit on how much you really scrutinized the decision to include that, and ways in which you look to really expand the meaning of the work that you created in the first place, because you kind of put a lot of like style and a lot of wow factor into developing these characters, and then to kind of like take it away at the end. And yeah, so essentially the same question, along with that interpretation, and just that was my comment.
Yeah. I think it's really a lot about the idea of extrapolating sort of technology and foregrounding technologies, but also it's connected to the fact that at the end of the work, for example, some audiences, do perhaps, there's a giggle, if you see the kind of kilographic sort of being washed away, but for me, that image is very much talking about the idea of the fact that, I can't make images without labor, and so, and in the same way that the fishermen or the cockle pickers, for their labor, one's able to have a certain cuisine, one can't make images without labor. And so, in some senses, they do symbolize the workers, they're the workers that are involved in making my images, and to a certain extent, there's this tabula rasa effect at the end where the, calligraphic images are being, washed away, in the same sense that Mao from the tabula rasa in Chinese culture. So there are all of these things which are connected to, whatever you want to call it, the death drive. There are all of these aspects, that one could think around the question of labor, the resurrection of ghosts. The fact that I have thought a lot about ghosts coming here to this city, the way that one community ghosts another community, and pretends that community doesn't exist. All of those things around ghosting and identity and geography, they're the kinds of issues that haunt 10,000 Waves and haunt my practice, basically, these days. So.
Just one question for you. It's about, I'm imagining that you've gotten some criticism or questions about the possible orientalizing or romanticization of the images that you're presenting. I'm just curious if that's how you respond to that, or kind of question of who gets to speak for whom, if that are the kinds of discussions that this film project has engendered.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm the man with the camera. And so when I look at this work, you know, I'm looking at the gendered aspects of it. I'm looking at Shinazery. I'm looking at Chinese culture. I'm looking at women. And, you know, I'm collaborating with over, 100 sort of people, Chinese people. We were the only Europeans, myself and my producer, involved in the project. And yeah, I mean, I think, you know, that I'm evoking all of the things around post-coloniality. Very interestingly, one of the things that happened when I went to China, first of all, I went on Mark Nash's coattails. He attended a Biennale, and it was in Guangzhou, and the theme of the triennale was farewell to the post-colonial. And there's a whole debate about it. Sahat Maharaj wrote a very interesting article, and I was interviewed by Gao Ximin, who was one of the curators. He is one of the curators who writes about 10,000 Waves. It was first shown in China in 2010, and subsequently is in Chinese Museum collections in a couple. But I remember him discussing this question of post-coloniality, and my answer to it was, well, farewell the post-colonial, hello market. And so I think the question of market, the question of whiteness, the question of Shanghai as this space which is both a Europeanized, you know, Shanghainese culture, you know, so I think that my gaze is there, and I think I'm also looking at Mazu's 15th century kind of landscape painting, you know, that's what I was looking at. And so if I go back to that period, that's what I'm looking at, you know. And so for me, it's really the challenge around how, not so much how I can authentically represent it, but what's my version of representing that. And of course, you know, I do take the pleasure of being a Black European making a work in that space, and sort of basically, in a way, Trinity Minhar used the phrase around the question of sort of speaking nearby. And so I think, you know, the question of a cross-identification or trans-cultural identification with those questions, the mapping of discourses around the Black Atlantic and slavery and migration and all of those things, in a way, they take me into directions. And so for me, I have to try and be faithful to those directions, you know. So I think, you know, the Oriental gaze is a gaze, you know, which is there, and it's there in a lot of, you know, Chinese work as well, made by Chinese subjects, you know. So I think it's, and Guangxi province originates, that is the space where people went to, you know, from the court when they were banned. You know, so it has that whole history, you know, and we actually found the Mazu mythology in the British Museum. You know, that's where I found these beautiful books. You know, and so that's all part of the making of the work. But I think, you know, if it can be a work that's acquired by, you know, Chinese museums, you know, well, that's good enough for me.
This is a good segue into a question I had regarding translation and your decision not to have any translation available. I'm wondering if in the museum context, the installation version, if there are translated texts available, or if it's something that you have occluded altogether, if it was a intentional decision.
Well, sometimes when we show it, we have the poem translated into English, and it's also in Mandarin, although it's written in English by someone who's a Shanghainese, but they teach at Macalester University in Minneapolis, in the English department. So, but I mean, on the whole, I'm not always into this question of translation. You know, I'm quite into the question of non-translation. In fact, you know, I made a work in 2000 called Vagabondia, which was in the Creole language, which is the language that my parents speak. And, you know, it's a language that was developed actually sort of against the master. And it was a language, you know, which, for the best part, if people spoke it on the island that my parents grew up on, in St. Lucia at school, they were beaten. You know, so I think this question of this translation and knowingness that we have, you know, that we have to know everything that's articulated, you know, is something that I want to question. You know, and so in the work, some parts are translated and some parts are not, but usually there's a kind of English, let's say there's an English part of the text that gets articulated elsewhere. Yeah, so, but sometimes I want things to be non-translated, because this question of translation, of knowing the other, like as if you can, you know, understand what people are saying, and then that's, you know, we've got the knowledge. I'm not quite sure about. So I think in this work there's a play with that question of translation and non-translation of language, of the poem.
You want to comment, Ellie?
Yeah.
Well, I have lots of, it's a fascinating topic for me, so I could go on, but I'll pass on.
Yeah, I meant to ask the question that Millie and Tanya asked before about your decision as far as like you know, multiplying multi-channels in an installation setting as opposed to a single channel or a single screen. But those questions were obviously already taken, so I'm going to sort of take the conversation to a different path, if I may. So what's your take as far as like the current state of cinema, in quotations, since we are oversaturated with interactivity, with, you know, the inclusion of smartphones in our daily lives now? What's your take as far as like the trajectory of the future of cinema now into, you know, the nether future?
I don't think cinema's in a bad place.
Yeah.
You know, so, I mean, I think sort of that, you know, I just think that cinema's in a bad place, period. You know, but I think there's interesting aspects which are developing in different languages. I think the question of technology and the promise of new technologies and what they're going to give to us are a kind of red herring. You know, so I think there's a real fetishization of new technologies, which I think we should worry about, but not in a kind of completely oppositional manner. It's not that I'm saying that new technologies are not useful and helpful and can't improve lives, you know. But I think there is something troubling about new technologies. I'm not someone who's at all against new technologies. I mean, my last work is shot in super high definition. It's the question of technology is all over it, basically. And, you know, there's lots of works that artists are making which deploy new technologies, and some of them are very interesting. But they're not, I think there's a bit of a fetishism around new technologies, you know, and that's interrupted our relationship to film, you know, and our relationship to stories that we tell and that sort of thing. Yeah, but I guess I might look to the museum and the gallery for interesting works, not to cinema itself. Okay, thank you.